This is AP Psychology, Chapter 15 on Personality. Personality is one of the characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. Sigmund Freud, in his Psychoanalytic Perspective, proposed that childhood sexuality and unconscious motives influence personality. For Sigmund Freud, conflict between pleasure-seeking and biological impulses and social restraints centered on three interacting systems: the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud believed that children develop through psychosexual stages and that people's later problems are rooted in how they resolve conflicts associated with these stages. The Neo-Freudians agreed with Freud's basic ideas but placed more emphasis on the conscious mind and on the social influences. Today's psychodynamic theorists agree with many of Freud's views, but not his idea that sex is the basis of personality. Contemporary research confirms that more than most of us realize, our lives are guided by non-conscious information processing. The humanistic perspective emphasizes the growth potential of healthy people. Abraham Maslow believed that if the basic human needs are met, people will strive to actualize their highest potential. Carl Rogers suggested that the genuine accepting of an empathetic helps others to develop a positive self-concept. The trait perspective attempts to describe the predispositions that underlie our actions. Though factor analysis researchers have isolated 5 distinct dimensions of personality, people's specific behaviors vary across situations. Their inner dispositions interact with particular environments. The social cognitive perspective emphasizes how personal cognition factors combine with the environment to influence behavior. More than other perspectives, it builds from the research on learning and cognition. Researchers assess how people's behaviors and beliefs both affect and are affected by their situations. Currently, the self is one of the Western psychology's more vigorously researched topics. Studies confirm the benefits of positive self-esteem, but also point to possible hazards of pride. Compared to defense, self-esteem, secure self-esteem depends on social and external evaluations that enable us to lose ourselves in relationships and purposes larger than self. Psychologists consider personality to be an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. B.R.H. Hergenhan observes that while other psychologists are concerned with human perception, intelligence, motivation, or development, personality theorists are in the unique position of studying the entire person. They have the monumental task of synthesizing the best information from the diverse fields of the discipline into a coherent, holistic configuration in the course of their work. Personality theorists address fundamental issues of human nature and individual differences. Duane Schultz has suggested that theorists answer to the following basic questions and define his or her image of human nature. One would be free will or determinism. Do we have a conscious awareness and control of ourselves? Are we free to choose to be masters of our fate? Or are we victims of biological factors, unconscious forces, or external stimuli? The second would be nature or nurture. Is our personality determined primarily by the abilities, temperaments, and predispositions we inherit, or are we shaped more strongly by the environments in which we live? 3 would be past, present, or future. Is personality development basically complete in early childhood, or is personality independent of the past, capable of being influenced by events and experiences in the present, and even by future aspirations and goals? Number 4 is uniqueness or universality. Is the personality of each individual unique, or are there broad personality patterns that fit large numbers of persons? Number 5 is equilibrium or growth. Are we primarily tension-reducing or pleasure-seeking animals, or are we motivated primarily by the need to grow, to reach our full potential, to reach for ever higher levels of self-expression and development? And then finally, 6, optimism or pessimism. Are human beings basically good or evil? Are we kind and compassionate or cruel and merciless? In his private practice, Freud found the nervous disorders often made no neurological sense. Piecing together his patients' accounts of their lives, he concluded that their disorders had psychological causes. His effort to understand these causes led to his theory of psychoanalysis. This is the first comprehensive theory of personality. Freud's clinical experience led him to develop this comprehensive theory of personality, which included unconscious mind, the psychosexual stages, and defense mechanism. Freud believed that the mind is like an iceberg, mostly hidden, with the unconscious containing thoughts and memories of which we are largely unaware. We had a reservoir of unconscious mind of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. Freud asked patients to say whatever they came to their minds and treated them through the practice of free association in order to tap into their unconsciousness. And here the patient would lay on the couch and just talk about whatever came to mind, and ultimately what would eventually result from this, and Freud would sit here, would be what was truly concerning the individual. Some of these thoughts were thoughts we store temporarily on our preconscious area. Our conscious awareness is the part of the iceberg that floats above the water. Initially, he thought the hypnosis might unlock the door to the unconscious. However, recognizing patients' uneven capacity for hypnosis, Freud turned to free association, which he believed to produce chain of thoughts in the patient's unconscious. He called this process his theory of personality, or his psychoanalysis. So another method to analyze the unconscious mind is through interpreting the manifest and latent content of dreams. The process of free association leads to this painful, embarrassing unconscious memories. Once these memories are retrieved and released in treatment of psychoanalysis, the patient begins to feel better. The mind is like an iceberg. It's mostly hidden, and below the surface lies the unconscious mind. The preconscious stores temporary memories. And so this is Freud's model. The personality develops as a result of our efforts to resolve conflicts between our biological impulses, our id, and social restraints, the superego. So here is your ego, which is the executive mediator. It's your conscious mind that is aware of what's going on in the world. Your superego is the social restraints that hold you back. And then the id are these unconscious desires to fulfill your needs. So the id unconsciously strives to satisfy basic sexual aggressive drives, operating the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification. The ego functions on the executive and mediates the demands of the id and the superego. The superego provides standards for judgments in the conscious and for future aspirations. Freud believed that the personality arises from our efforts to resolve conflict between our biological impulses and social restraints against them. He theorized that the ego, which functions on reality principle, and the superego, an internalized set of ideals. The superego demands often oppose the ids, and the ego, as the executive part of the personality, seeks to reconcile the two. Freud believed that the personality formed the first few years of life, divided into various psychosexual stages. Freud believed that the conflicts between the id and the superego led to a thing that we refer to as Freudian slips. Freud believed such slips were motivated by unconscious conflicts, a hidden motive that could presumably be found for even most innocuous mistakes if it was investigated with psychoanalytic methods. The Austrian president, wrote Freud, secretly wished he was already in a position to close the meeting from which the little good was to be expected. And this is when the Austrian parliament opened his session by thundering, "I declare this meeting closed." In answering a phone, a preoccupied business executive would pick up the receiver and bellow, "Come in." At a copying machine, a secretary counts copies. 8, 9, 10, Jack, Queen, King. A jogger finishes her run and then tosses her shirt into the toilet instead of into the laundry hamper. Today's cognitive psychologists favor a more parsimonious explanation for the slips that are part of everyday life. They argue that they are a natural byproduct of how our minds process information and direct action. For example, the single most common type of slip seems to involve the intrusion of a strong habit. An activity that is more familiar, is more frequent, or has been recently performed interferes with the intended behavior. The secretary at the copy machine had recently been playing cards, for instance. Psychologist Donald Norman calls this kind of mistake a capture error. Norman states, pass too near a well-formed habit and it will capture your behavior. If the habit is strong enough, even cues that only partially match the situation in which it usually occurs are likely to activate it. Norman cites William James' report on absent-minded person who went to the bedroom to dress for dinner but instead put on his pajamas and got into bed. Most actions, argues Norman, are carried out automatically by subconscious mechanisms. At a conscious level, we make a general selection, but the actual execution of the intended act occurs without further reflection. Such mental laziness is typically beneficial, for it permits us to save our mental resources for more important things. Occasionally, however, we may forget whether we have performed the action, as is evident in the psychologist's report. As I was leaving the bathroom this morning, it suddenly struck me that I couldn't remember whether or not I had shaved. I had to feel my chin to establish that I had. Attention is a critical factor in preventing slips. When attention lags, a competing response is more likely to replace the intended one. Sometimes the components of an action may become misblended, as when the decision about whether to say momentary or instantaneous produces momentous or momentousness. Or Norman gives an example many of us can identify with. We decide not to take another bite of delicious but calorie-laden cake, but after a brief lapse, the cake somehow is eaten anyway. Jerry Berger notes that the inherent difficulty of studying Freudian slips experimentally, they occur when we least expect them, and laboratory subjects could talk a long time without ever making one. However, researchers have developed ingenious ways to circumventing the problem. For example, male undergraduates in one study were asked to complete some innocent-looking sentences either in the presence of an attractive or scantily clad female experimenter or with a male experimenter. According to Freud, which group would make more slips of the tongue? Well, completing sentences such as, with the telescope, the details of the distant landscape were easy to those in the female experimenter group were more likely to say make out than were other subjects. For the sentence, the lid won't stay on regardless of how much the same men were more likely to respond with screw it. In second study, males were asked to read quickly presented word pairs. those in the presence of a female were more likely to read Bind Foddy as fine body and Lou Geggs as good legs. As Berger indicates, these findings may be used to support Freudian theory. However, other interpretations are clearly possible. For example, linguists would likely be to explain these slips in However, other interpretations are clearly possible. For example, linguists would be likely to explain these slips in terms of cognitive connections and activation of linguistic pathways. That is, the salience of sexuality in these situations activates our memory of sexually related information. They prepare a kind of cognitive pathway between beginning of the sentence and the double entendre word, making selection of a sexually related word more likely. Freud believed that personality formed during the first few years of life divided into psychosexual stages. During these stages, the id's pleasure-seeking energies focus on the pleasure-sensitive areas called erogenous zones. Freud divided the development of personality into 5 psychosexual stages. Freud maintained that children pass through the series of psychosexual stages during which the id's pleasure-seeking energies focus on distinct pleasure-sensitive areas of the body called erogenous zones. During the oral stage of 0 to 18 months, pleasure centers on the mouth, and during the anal stage, 18 to 36 months, on the bowel and bladder elimination. During the critical phallic stage, 3 to 6 years, pleasure centers on the genitals. Boys experience the Oedipus Complex with unconscious sexual desires toward their mother and hatred for their father. They cope with these threatening feelings through identification with their father, thereby incorporating many of his values and developing a sense of gender identity. The latency stage, 6 years to puberty, in which sexuality is dormant, gives way to the genital stage. Puberty on, as youths begin to experience sexual feelings towards others. In Freud's view, the maladaptive adult results from conflicts unresolved during the oral, phallic, anal, and phallic stages. Charles Potke and Bem Allen describe the case study of Little Hans as a cornerstone of Freud's ideas of the Oedipus Complex. 5-year-old Hans is afraid to leave his house because of an irrational fear that a horse would bite him. Hans developed the fear after having seen a horse fall down in the street. Freud believed the real target of Hans' fear was something else. Through displacement, Hans' unconscious anxiety had merely been redirected from its original source onto horses. Freud suggested that Hans was actually afraid of his erotic feelings towards his mother and aggressive wishes towards his father. He supported his hypothesis with the following observations. Hans has said he wanted to sleep with his mother, coax with or caress her, be married to her, and have children just like Daddy. 2. Hans experienced castration anxiety. His parents warned if he continued to play with his whittler, it would be cut off. He noticed that his sister had no whittler. Hans wanted his mother all to himself and was jealous of his father and feared his mother would prefer his father's bigger whittler, which was like a horse. Hans was most afraid of horses with black muzzles, similar to his father's black mustache. Hans had accidentally knocked a statue of a horse from its stand, and when he saw the real horse fall down, he recognized his own aggressive impulse that his father fall down and die, an idea that frightened him and that he could not consciously acknowledge. Horses then were symbolic substitute for Hans' father, whom he feared and hated. 5. Through psychoanalysis, the unconscious was made conscious, and Hans' fears were brought into the open, and he achieved insight. Freud observed, Hans was really a little Oedipus who wanted to have his father out of the way to get rid of him so that he might be alone with his handsome mother. Okay. Um, Children cope with these feelings of threatening feelings by repressing them, by identifying through the rival parent. Through this process of identification, their superego gains strength to incorporate their parent's values. The ego's protective methods of reducing anxiety by consciously distorting reality. Repression banishes the anxiety, arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories from consciousness. Regression leads the individual faced with anxiety to retreat to a more infantile psychosexual stage. Defense mechanisms are the reaction formation, which causes the ego to unconsciously switch unacceptable impulses into their opposites. People may express feelings of purity when they may be suffering anxiety from unconscious feelings about sex. And then projection leads people to disguise their own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. Rationalization offers self-justifying explanations in place of the real, more threatening unconscious reasons for one's actions, and displacement shifts sexual or aggressive impulses towards a more acceptable or less threatening object or person, redirecting anger toward a safer outlet. Defense mechanisms reduce or redirect anxiety in various ways, but always distorting reality. Repression, which underlies the other defense mechanisms, banishes anxiety, arousing thoughts from consciousness. Regression involves retreat to an earlier, more infantile stage of development, and reaction formation makes unacceptable impulses look like their opposites. Projection attributes threatening impulses to others. Rationalization offers self-justifying explanations for behavior, and displacement diverts these impulses to a more acceptable object. The Neo-Freudians accepted Freud's basic idea regarding personality structures, the importance of the unconscious, the shaping of personality in children, and the dynamics of anxiety and defense mechanisms. However, in contrast to Freud, the Neo-Freudians generally place more emphasis on the conscious mind in interpreting the experience and coping with the environment, and they argued that we have more positive motives than sex and aggression. Unlike other Neo-Freudians, Carl Jung agreed with Freud that the unconscious exerts a powerful influence. In addition, he suggested that the collective unconscious is shared, inherited reservoir of memory and traces from other species' history. Contemporary psychodynamic theorists and therapists reject the notion that sex is the basics of personality, but agree with Freud that much of our mental life is unconscious and that we struggle with inner conflicts and that childhood shapes our personalities and attachment styles. So Jung believed in this collective unconsciousness, which contained common reservoir of images derived from species past. This is why many cultures share certain myths, images, and such as the mother being a symbol of nurturance. Like Freud, Adler believed in childhood tensions. However, these tensions were social in nature, not sexual. A child struggles with an inferiority complex during growth and strives for superiority and power. Alfred Adler is the one who gave us the term inferiority complex. Like Adler, Karen Horney believed in the social aspects of childhood growth and development. She countered Freud's assumption that women have weak superegos and suffer from a condition known as penis envy. Assessing the unconscious, evaluating personality from the unconscious mind's perspective would require a psychological instrument known as a projective test that would reveal the hidden unconscious mind. Projective tests provide ambiguous stimuli that are designed to trigger projection in one's inner dynamic. In thematic apperception tests, people view ambiguous pictures, then make up stories about them. Presumably, their accounts reflect the interests and inner feelings. The Rorschach Inkblot test seeks to identify people's interfering feelings and conflicts by analyzing their interpretations of 10 ink blots. Critics question the validity and reliability of these tests. Nonetheless, many clinicians continue to use them. Thematic apperception tests was developed by Henry Murray. The TAT is a projective test in which people express their inner feelings and interests through stories they make up about ambiguous scenes. The most widely used projective test uses a set of 10 ink blots and was designed by Herman Rorschach. It seeks to identify people's inner feelings by analyzing the interpretations of the blots. Critics argue that projective tests lack both the reliability or consistency of its results and the validity of predicting what it's supposed to. When evaluating the same patient, even after trained raters come up with the different interpretations of reliability, projective tests may misdiagnose a normal individual as pathological. So, evaluating the psychoanalytic perspective, modern research shows that personality develops throughout life and is not fixed in childhood. Freud underemphasized peer influence on the individual, which may be as powerful as parental influence. Gender identity may develop before 5 and 6 years of age. There may be other reasons for dreams besides wish fulfillment. Verbal slips can be explained on the basis of cognitive processing or verbal choices, and suppressed sexuality leads to psychological disorders. Sexual inhibition has decreased, but psychological disorders have not. Freud's psychoanalytic theory rests on repression of the painful experience into the unconscious mind. The majority of children and death camp survivors and battle-scarred veterans are unable to repress painful experiences into their unconscious minds. Critics contend that many of Freud's specific ideas are implausible, unvalidated, or contradicted by new research. That his theory offers only after-the-fact explanations. Recent findings question the overriding importance of childhood experiences, the degree of parental influence, and the timing of gender identity formation, the significance of childhood sexuality, and the existence of hidden content in dreams. Many researchers now believe that repression rarely, if ever, occurs. Nevertheless, Freud drew psychology's attention to the unconscious and to our struggle to cope with the anxiety and sexuality. Indeed, studies testing terror management theory show that thinking about one's morality proves enough anxiety to intensify prejudices. Freud also focused on the conflict between biological impulses and social restraints. Unquestionably, his cultural impact has been enormous. Freud was right about the unconscious mind. Modern research shows that the existence of the non-conscious information processing does take place. Schemas that automatically control perceptions and interpretations, parallel processing during vision and thinking, implicit memories, emotions that activate instantly without consciousness. The scientific merits of Freud's theory have been criticized, and psychoanalysis is merely testable. Most of its concepts arise out of clinical practice, which are the after-the-fact explanation. The Humanistic Perspective. By the 1960s, psychologists became discontent with Freud's negativity and mechanistic psychology of behaviorists. According to Maslow, The self-actualization is the motivation to fulfill one's potential. It's the ultimate psychological need that arises after basic physical and psychological needs are met and self-esteem is achieved. It is the ultimate in his effort to turn psychology's attention from baser motives of troubled people to the growth potential of healthy people who are thought to be basically good, Maslow reflects the humanistic perspective. Maslow proposed that we as individuals are motivated by a hierarchy of needs. Beginning with the physiological needs, we try to reach the state of self-actualization, fulfilling our potential. If the tendency towards self-actualization is innate, why are not more adults self-actualized? Maslow estimated that only 1% are. He offered 4 basic explanations for this number. Number 1, self-actualization is at the top of the motivational hierarchy. This makes it the weakest of all needs and the most easily impeded. He wrote, "This inner nature is not strong and overpowering and unmistakably like the instincts of animals. It is weak and delicate and subtle and easily overcome by habit, cultural pressure, and wrong attitudes towards it." Maslow identified Jonah complex as another obstacle to self-actualization. We fear and doubt the Jonah complex. We fear and doubt our own abilities and potentials. To become self-actualized, one must have enough courage to sacrifice safety for personal growth. Too often, fear takes precedence over the challenge of self-actualization. The cultural environment may also stifle self-actualization. By imposing certain norms on major segments of the population, definitions of manliness may prevent the male child from developing traits such as sympathy, kindness, and tenderness, all of which characterize the self-actualized person. Childhood experiences may inhibit personal growth. Maslow observed that children from warm, secure, friendly homes are more likely to choose experiences that lead to personal growth. Excessive control and coddling is obviously harmful, but so is excessive permissiveness. Too much freedom in childhood can lead to anxiety and insecurity, which can prevent further growth. Maslow called for freedom within limits in which there is a right mixture of permissiveness and regulation. Carl Rogers agreed with Maslow that people are basically good and are endowed with self-actualizing tendency. To nurture growth in others, Rogers advised being genuine, empathetic, and accepting, offering unconditional positive regard. In such a climate, people can develop a deeper self-awareness and a more realistic positive self-concept. So Carl Rogers gives us unconditional positive regard. In an effort to assess personality, Rogers asked people to describe themselves as they would like to be, ideal, and as they actually are, real. If the two descriptions were close, the individual had a positive self-concept. All of our thoughts and feelings about ourselves in answer to the question, "Who am I?" refers to the self-concept. Humanistic psychologists assess personality through questionnaires on which people report their self-concept. One questionnaire asks people to compare their actual self with their ideal self. Other humanistic psychologists maintain that we can only understand each person's unique experience through interviews and intimate conversations. Humanistic psychologists assess personality through questionnaires on which people report their self-concept and by seeking to understand others and subjective personal experiences in therapy. Humanistic psychology has a pervasive impact on counseling, education, child rearing, and management. Concepts in humanistic psychology are vague and subjective and lack a scientific basis. Gender identity may develop before ages 5 and 6. First, critics complained that the perspective concepts are vague and subjective. For example, the description of a self-actualizing people seems more a reflection of Maslow's personal values and scientific description. Second, the individualism promoted by the humanistic psychology may promote self-indulgence, selfishness, and erosion of moral restraints. Third, humanistic psychology fails to appreciate the reality of our human capacity for evil. Its naive optimism may lead to apathy about major social problems. Freud attempted to explain personality in terms of hidden unconscious motives. In contrast to the psychoanalytic perspective, there are trait theorists attempt to describe personality in terms of stable and enduring behavior patterns or dispositions to feel and act. Some theorists use the dominant traits and their associated characteristics to describe personality traits. An individual's unique constellation of durable dispositions and constant ways of behaving or traits constitutes his or her personality. Examples of traits are honest, dependable, moody, impulsive. Recently, Stephen Rubinizer and his colleagues provided an interesting analysis of the personality traits of the past U.S. presidents. The researcher asked 115 biographers, historians, and political science to help them rate the presidents on detailed personality trait scales in the 5 years before they took office. Rubinizer and his colleagues were particularly interested in the qualities linked to successful presidential job performance. Ratings of success were obtained from hundreds of historians. The researchers reported that openness to experience produced the highest correlation with historians' ratings of greatness. The best performers could learn as they went along. Being an extrovert, assertive, and achievement-oriented were also strongly associated with success. On the other hand, being agreeable was not. That is, being cooperative and easily led did not mesh with greatness. Being straightforward was not predictive of greatness. In fact, a tendency to tell the truth, suggests Rubinizer, can actually harm a president's shot at being considered historically great. Finally, tender-mindedness is predictive of effectiveness. Great presidents know it's all about feelings, argued Rubinizer, theirs and the voters. Other findings, in general, the historians rated all the presidents as far less straightforward than typical citizens. Presidents scored only at the 15th percentile. Among those scoring lowest on being honest were Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln seemed to soften his position on slavery in an attempt to keep the country unified. Over time, presidents have become more extroverted but less curious and creative. Washington was at the top of the class at being conscientious, but ranked lower than today's average American in openness, extroversion, and agreeableness. Lincoln was moderately extroverted, agreeable, and conscientious, but unlike other successful presidents, he was neurotic and occasionally suffering bouts of deep despair. Being a bit disorganized, like Lincoln, was also an asset. Tidiness was not. Openness to experience overlaps with intelligence because one must be intelligent to appreciate new experiences. Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson scored high on both. Jimmy Carter had two fatal flaws, a lack of assertiveness and a tendency to be straightforward. One way has been to suggest traits such as anxiety that some theory regards as basic. A newer technique is factor analysis, a statistical procedure that identifies clusters of behaviors that tend to appear together. For example, through factor analysis, Hans and Sybil Eisnick reduce normal variations to 2 or 3 genetically influenced dimensions, including extroversion, introversion, emotion, stability, and instability Brain activity scans suggest that extroverts and introverts differ in their levels of arousal, with extroverts seeking stimulation because their normal brain arousal level is relatively low. Jerome Kagan maintains that heredity, by influencing autonomic nervous system arousal, also affects the temperament and behavioral style, which helps define our personality. Personality types assessed by measures like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator consist of a number of traits. For example, feeling a type personality is sympathetic, appreciative, and tactful. Factor analysis, this is a statistical approach used to describe and relate personality traits. Raymond Cattell used this approach to develop the 16 personality factor inventory. Cattell found that the large groups of traits could be reduced down to 16 core personality traits based on statistical correlations. Hans and Sybil Eisnick suggested personality could be reduced down to two polar dimensions, extroversion and introversion, and emotional stability and instability. Personality inventories are questionnaires, often with true, false, or agree, disagree items designed to gauge a wide range of feelings and behavior, assessing several traits at once. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is the most widely researched and clinically used of all personality tests. It was originally developed to identify emotional disorders. Psychologists assess several traits at once by administering personality inventories in which people respond to items designed to measure a wide range of feelings and behavior. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is the most widely used personality inventory. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory items were empirically derived, that is, from a large pool of items. The test developers selected those on which particular diagnostic groups differed. The objective scoring of the test does not guarantee its validity. And for example, those taking the MMPI for employment screening may give socially desirable responses that create a good impression. Today's trait researchers believe that Eisnick's personality dimensions are too narrow and Cattell's 16 PF is too large, so middle range 5 factors of traits does a better job of assessment. You can remember this, the big 5 is with using the acronym CANOE. It stands for conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. CANOE. Researchers have isolated 5 distinct personality dimensions dubbed the Big 5: emotional stability, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. These traits appear to be stable in adulthood, largely heritable, common to all cultures, and good predictors of other personal attributes. Locating an individual on these 5 dimensions provides a comprehensive picture of personality. So how stable are these traits? They're quite stable in adulthood, however they change over development. How heritable are they? 50% or so for each trait. How about cultures? These traits are common across cultures. And can they predict their personal attributes? Yes, conscientious people are morning type and extroverted are evening type. Walter Mischel points out that traits may be enduring, but resulting behavior in various situations is different. Therefore, traits are not good predictors of behavior. The trait theorists argue that behaviors from a situation may be different, but average behavior remains the same. Therefore, traits matter. Traits are socially significant. and influence our health and thinking and performance. Expressive styles in speaking and gestures demonstrate trait consistency. Observers are able to judge people's behavior and feelings in as little as 30 seconds, and in one particular case, as little as 2. Although people's traits seem to persist over time, critics in trait perspective note that human behavior varies widely from situation to situation. Thus, traits are not good predictors of behavior. For example, being conscientious on one occasion is only modestly related to being conscientious on another occasion. Defenders of trait perspective note that despite these variations, a person's average behavior across different situations is fairly consistent. We do not have distinct personality traits. Moreover, research suggests that our traits are socially significant. They influence our health, our thinking, and our job performance. Albert Bandura believes that personality traits is the result of interaction that takes place between the person and their social context. In informal social situations, our expressive styles, our animation, manner, and speaking and gestures are impressively consistent. Moreover, we can judge individual differences in expressiveness and in a matter of seconds. Thus, we may form lasting impressions within a few moments of meeting someone. Researchers suggest people have little voluntary control over their expressiveness. Bandura called the process of interacting with our environment reciprocal determinism. The three factors, behavior, cognition, and environment, are interlocking determinants of each other. Specific ways in which individuals and environments interact. Different people choose different environments. The school you attend and the music you listen to are partly based on your disposition. Our personalities shape how we react to events. Anxious people react to situations differently than calm people. Our personalities shape situations. How we view and treat people influences how they treat us. Behavior emerges from an interplay of external and internal influences. The social cognitive psychologists emphasize our sense of personal control, whether we control the environment or the environment controls us. The external locus of control refers to the perception that chance or outside forces beyond our personal control determine our fate. The internal locus control refers to the perception that we control our own fate. The social cognitive perspective applies principles of learning and cognition to understanding of the personality. Reciprocal determinism refers to the interacting influences between personality and environmental factors. Interactions between individuals and environments occur when different people choose different environments, when our personalities shape how we interpret and react to events, and when our personalities unless people believe that you can produce desired effects and forestall undesired ones by their actions, argues Albert Bandura, they have little incentive to act or to preserve in face of difficulties. Furthermore, he observes that perceived efficacy is closely linked to our belief that important skills can be acquired through practice. In a study conducted by his colleague Bob Wood, Bandura asked business graduates to manage a computer simulation of an organization. Perceived efficacy was manipulated by telling the participants that the simulation demanded skills that were either innate or that could be acquired through practice. Those who thought the skills could be acquired set challenging goals for themselves and were efficient in their analytic thinking and achieved high performance. In contrast, those who believed the skills were innate set lower goals and were more erratic in their thinking, and performance gradually deteriorated. These findings highlight the danger of what Bandura called bell curve thinking, the belief that intelligence is largely innate. We argue over small ethnic and racial differences, but we ignore the huge influence of motivation and self-management factors in intellectual performance. Bandura's daughter, Mary Bandura, has demonstrated that children who view intelligence as an acquirable skill are highly resilient in their personal efficacy beliefs. Setbacks are viewed as correctable as due to insufficient effort, lack of knowledge, or faulty strategies rather than as the result of inherent personal deficiencies. Children with strong efficacy beliefs redouble their efforts in face of difficulty, while uh, uh, one must be realistic about difficult odds. It is equally important to be optimistic that one can beat the odds. Bandura's ideas are related to the distinction of Carol Dweck, who has made between entity theorists who believe the human traits are fixed and incremental theorists who maintain that traits are malleable. In examining how our interactions with our environment, social cognitive psychologists emphasize our sense of personal control. That is whether we learn to see ourselves as controlling or being controlled by our environment. People who perceive an internal rather than an external locus of control achieve more in school and are more independent and are less depressed. Moreover, they are better able to delay gratification and cope with various stresses. Faced with repeated traumatic events over which they have no control, people come to feel helpless, hopeless, and depressed. This learned helplessness may result in the passivity in later situations where their efforts could make a difference. In contrast, under conditions of personal freedom and empowerment, people thrive. An optimistic or pessimistic attributional style is your way of explaining positive or negative events. Positive psychology aims to discover and promote conditions that enable individuals and communities to thrive. Our attributional style is our way of explaining positive and negative events and can reveal how effective or helpless we feel. For example, those with optimistically see setbacks as flukes rather than signs of incompetence are likely to be more persistent and successful. Optimists have been found to outlive pessimists as well as to have fewer illnesses. Excessive optimism, however, can lead to complacency and can blind us to real risks. The study of personal control and optimism reflects the new interest in positive psychology and scientific study of optimal human functioning. Although it shares humanistic psychology and interest in fostering human fulfillment, its origins and methodology are scientific. Positive psychology studies positive emotions and character in positive groups, communities, and cultures. So social cognitive psychologists observe people in realistic and simulated situations because they find that the best way to predict the behavior of others in similar situations. Critics say the social cognitive psychologists pay a lot of attention to the situation and pay less attention to the individual, his unconscious mind, his emotions, and his genetics. Social cognitive researchers observe how behaviors and beliefs both affect and are affected by their situations. They have found the best way to predict someone's behavior in a given situation is to observe that person's behavior pattern in similar situations. Critics argue that the social cognitive perspective focuses so much on the situation that it fails to appreciate the importance of a person's inner traits, emotions, unconscious motives, Indeed, research indicates that our biologically influenced traits predict behavior at work, love, and play, and at the same time, social cognitive perspective builds on psychology's well-established concepts of learning, cognition, and reminds us of the power of social situations. Positive psychology, such as humanistic psychology, attempts to foster human fulfillment. Positive psychology, in addition, seeks positive subjective well-being, positive character, and positive social groups. The self is Research on the self is long history because the self organizes thinking, feelings, and actions. It is a critical part of our personality. Research focuses on the different selves we possess. Some we dream and others we dread. Research studies how we overestimate the concern that others evaluate our appearance and performance and blunders, the spotlight effect. Research studies the self-reference effect in recall. The self is one of Western psychology's most vigorously researched topics. Underlying the research is the assumption that the self as an organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions is pivotal in understanding personality. One example of research on the self is the study of possible selves. It explores people's visions of the self they dream of becoming. Such possible selves motivate us by laying out specific goals and calling forth the energy to work toward them. Another example is the study of the spotlight effect, which reflects our tendency to overestimate others, noticing and evaluating our appearance, performance, and blunders. Still, a third example is research on the self-reliance phenomena, our tendency to remember information better if we encode it in terms of ourselves. Maslow and Rogers argued that a successful life results from a healthy self-image or self-esteem. The following are two reasons why low self-esteem results in personal problems. When self-esteem is deflated, we view ourselves and others critically. Low self-esteem reflects reality, our failure in meeting challenges or surmounting difficulties. People who have high self-esteem have fewer sleepless nights, are less conforming, are more persistent at difficult tasks, and are less shy and lonely, and are just plain happier. Some research shows the destructive effect of low self-esteem. For example, temporarily deflating people's self-esteem can lead them to disparage others, express greater racial prejudice, and other researchers suggest that personal problems and failure may cause low self-esteem. Self-esteem reflects reality, thus feeling good about oneself and follows doing well. According to this explanation, the best way to foster self-esteem in children is to help them meet challenges, not rewarding them despite their failures. The societal pursuit of high self-esteem for everyone may literally end up doing considerable harm. This is a psychological review article by Roy Brymeister. In a massive interdisciplinary review of the literature on aggression, crime, and violence, the authors conclude that a high, not low, self-esteem underlies violent behavior, particularly favorable self-appraisals that may be inflated or ill-founded and are confronted with an external evaluation that disputes them. In short, some people turn aggressive when they receive feedback that contradicts their favorable images of themselves. Clearly, Braumeister and his colleagues are not saying that everyone with high self-esteem is predisposed to violence. Rather, it is primarily those who refuse to lower their inflated self-appraisals who become violent. Teenagers who do not feel they have received the respect they deserve are more likely to strike out than those who genuinely believe themselves unworthy. Studies of murder, rape, domestic abuse, and even terrorism show that violence occurs when a person with high, often inflated opinion of himself or herself is challenged by someone considered inferior. For example, one study of sexual offenders found that rapists sometimes choose a particular victim in order to disabuse of her sense of superiority. That is, the woman gave the man the impression that she thought she was better than he was, and so he raped her as a way of proving her wrong. Another interesting example of the relationship between high self-esteem and aggression involves racist violence. Nazism includes the ideology of racial superiority that justifies violence against those deemed weak or inferior. At its peak, the Ku Klux Klan was most violent towards two groups that challenged the idea of white supremacy, namely upperly mobile blacks and whites who helped blacks by treating them as equals. One study of whites belonging to hate groups indicated that those engaged in violent behavior actually were better educated and had higher career aspirations than less violent members of such groups. Baumeister and his colleagues conclude that if, as we have some argued, low self-esteem or even hidden self-doubts is the cause of violence, it'd be therapeutically prudent to make every effort to convince rapists, murderers, wife beaters, and professional hitmen, tyrants and torturers, and others that they are superior beings. However, there is clear evidence that this is something they already believe. If any modification to self-appraisal were to be attempted, suggest the authors, then perhaps it would be better to try instilling some modesty and humility. Clearly, the questions about relationship between self-esteem and aggression continue. Brent Donlin and his colleagues reported significant relationship between low self-esteem and real-world externalizing problems such as delinquency and antisocial behavior. The relationship held for research participants for both the United States and New Zealand, and both adolescents and college students. In attempting to reconcile their findings with Baumeister's results, the researchers suggest that we must draw the distinction between narcissism, Baumeister's primary focus, and healthy self-regard. They believe it is reasonable to conclude that both low self-esteem and narcissism contribute to externalizing problems. In addition, Donlin and his colleagues suggest that self-esteem may relate differently to the laboratory aggression than it does to real-world aggression. For example, lab studies typically examine aggression provoked by competitive tasks in which self-evaluation processes have been activated. It may be socially appropriate to blast one's opponent with a white noise in the context of an experiment that has been sanctioned by a university. In contrast, where real-world externalizing problems occur in a wide range of contexts that may have distinct correlates. Clearly, real-world externalizing problems are explicitly undesirable, antisocial, and in most cases illegal. So people maintain their self-esteem and their low status by valuing things they achieve and comparing themselves to people in similar positions. We accept responsibility for good deeds and success more than for bad deeds and failures. Defensive self-esteem is fragile and egotistic, whereas secure self-esteem is fragile and less dependent on external evaluation. Members of groups who experience discrimination and low status maintain their self-esteem by valuing the things that they excel and attributing the problems to prejudice and comparing themselves to those in their own group. Self-serving bias, or our readiness to perceive ourselves favorably, is evident in our tendency to accept more responsibility for good deeds than for bad deeds, and for success than for failures. Most people also see themselves as better than average. Defensive self-esteem is fragile and focuses on sustaining itself, which makes failure and criticism feel threatening. Like low self-esteem, defense self-esteem correlates with antisocial behavior. In contrast, secure self-esteem is less fragile because it depends less on external evaluations. Feeling accepted for who we are enables us to lose ourselves in relationships and purposes larger than the self. This concludes chapter 15 of AP Psychology. I hope you found that enlightening. Thank you.